Let us sit down and look at the real numbers together. I remember back when I was just 22 years old and managed to save my very first $20,000. I truly believed I was an absolute financial genius who had fully figured out the entire universe. The reality was that I was just a lucky passenger in a roaring bull market right before the reality of risk gave me a massive wake-up call. Now that I am 26 and have built up my first $100,000 through slow discipline, I see things differently. When we look at the world today, we see a lot of people chasing pure efficiency and high margins at all costs. They talk about optimizing assets and scaling down budget options as if consumers are just lines on a spreadsheet. But tonight, I want to walk you through a strange development in the global gold market that most people are completely missing. Something very significant is shifting under the surface of the international monetary system. Goldman Sachs recently published a report suggesting that central banks are buying far more gold than what the official data suggests. The more I dig into this story, the more I realize we are witnessing a fundamental shift in how sovereign wealth is being protected. Countries do not accumulate massive amounts of secret physical gold unless they have serious doubts about the trajectory of the current system. This is not just another story about a bank updating their price targets for a commodity. It is a story about the structural integrity of the global currency reserves that have defined the last 50 years. Official reserve data has not been capturing the full picture of central bank gold purchases for at least 10 months. This means that central banks have been accumulating significantly more physical bullion than what is being reported to the International Monetary Fund. We are talking about sustained aggressive physical accumulation during one of the largest debt bubbles in modern history. To understand why this gap exists, we have to look at the plumbing of the London gold market. London has long been the center of global gold trading where governments handle their large-scale acquisitions. Because the United Kingdom produces almost no gold domestically, it has historically been easy to estimate total central bank purchases. You simply reconcile the outflows from London vaults with the reported export data from the region. Usually these numbers align with perfect mathematical precision. But starting in August of 2025, the vaults started draining while the export data remained suspiciously flat. Imagine a warehouse with a glass door where you can see the inventory disappearing in real time. Yet when you check the shipping logs at the exit, there is no record of anything moving. This is exactly the discrepancy that analysts at Goldman Sachs have finally identified. If you apply this unaccounted for gold to total central bank activity, the purchase volume jumps up by roughly 70%. This does not mean banks just started buying gold yesterday. It means they never stopped buying. They just moved their strategy into the shadows to avoid market volatility and political scrutiny. Gold essentially has two different classifications that can be confusing to a casual observer. There is non-monetary gold, which is the commercially traded metal we see in the retail and investment markets. Then there is monetary gold, which is the specific classification used when a central bank claims it as an official reserve asset. Historically, central banks would purchase gold and export it before classifying it as a reserve. That process made it visible and transparent in the public export reporting records. But the loophole now being exploited is that central banks are having London custodians purchase the gold directly. They classify it as a reserve asset within the vault and then export it without any formal public reporting requirement. This loophole is not technically new, but the sheer scale of its current usage is unprecedented. It begs the question of why this is happening with such urgency right now in 2026. I suspect the answer tells us exactly where the global monetary system is heading next. While I cannot say with absolute certainty which specific nations are behind the missing gold, I think China is a logical place to start. They have been an aggressive buyer for years, and they have a proven track record of opacity regarding their actual holdings. They went over a year without reporting a single purchase to the International Monetary Fund before announcing a massive jump. This behavior makes perfect sense if you look at their broader strategy to shift power away from Western institutions. They are building out the Shanghai Gold Exchange as a direct competitor to the London market. They are setting in motion cross-boundary trade clearing systems that allow nations to settle international debts in physical gold. This is not a project they are acting on alone because they are clearly working within a broader coalition of nations. Many people ask me what happened to the BRICS alliance and why we do not hear as much about them as we used to. My answer is that they did not fail. They just got wise enough to stop shouting every single move they make from the rooftops. They realize that the long game requires quiet execution rather than loud geopolitical posturing. The hidden export loophole is being used by any sovereign buyer who wants to avoid the gaze of the dollar-dominated system. If you look at the trigger point in 2022 when central banks started buying gold in earnest, it was clearly prompted by the freezing of Russian assets. When the global financial system seized hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assets, every other country looked around and realized they could be next. It introduced massive counterparty risk to holding dollar-denominated debt. It was not just a concern about nominal interest rates or creditworthiness. It was the realization that your national wealth could be weaponized against you with the push of a digital button. Central banks are moving into gold because it is the only asset that carries zero counterparty risk. You do not have to worry about a central bank shutting off your access to your own reserves. The old saying remains true for nations just as it does for individuals. If you hold the physical metal, you own it. These institutions are not worried about whether the price of gold goes up or down on a monthly basis. They are hedging against the total devaluation of the currency system they created. Every single purchase of gold on a large scale is a silent vote of no confidence in the fiat currency machine. The dollar is still king, but the debt cycle required to keep that king on the throne has reached a breaking point. Without constant foreign buyers for treasury debt, you cannot continue to print and borrow at this current velocity. My theory is that many of these banks are moving in total secrecy because the truth of their de-dollarization would be too politically explosive. Maybe we will know the full extent of these holdings in a year, or maybe we will never know, but it does not change the core reality. If the institutions creating the currency are ditching their own product in favor of physical gold, that is all the data we need. The days of a single dominant currency system are numbered, and this has massive implications for your personal purchasing power. This is why I constantly talk about the importance of positioning your own portfolio for a different type of reality. These central banks are not waiting for the final day to see the news on their television screens. They understand the trajectory of the currency life cycle, and they are getting into position today. If you have questions about your own personal strategy, you can always look for professional guidance from experts who understand currency cycles. I speak to people all the time who feel overwhelmed by the complexity of the global news cycle. But when you strip away the noise, you realize that protecting your wealth is a matter of basic mathematical logic. We specialize in education and helping people understand how to navigate these long-term transitions. I know some people in the comments say that this is just a pitch for gold and silver. Of course we believe in gold and silver. I personally protect my own wealth with these assets because they have survived every currency collapse in history, but we are so much more than a dealer. We are a source of education and a partner in your long-term planning for what is coming next. Take this time to audit your own exposure to currency risk. Are you diversified enough to survive a situation where your primary currency loses significant value? Or are you concentrated entirely in one system that is currently experiencing its own version of a structural reset? When you look at the historical data of major empires and their currency dominance, you see a repetitive pattern of expansion followed by inevitable dilution. The Roman Empire clipped the coins, the British Empire inflated their pound, and today we see the exact same pressures being exerted on the dollar. You do not need to be a history professor to understand that when the quantity of a currency grows faster than the underlying economy, the purchasing power must decline. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a fundamental law of supply and demand applied to money. If you are holding cash as your sole store of value, you are betting that the current rate of dilution will not affect your future. But the central banks are signaling that they no longer trust that outcome. They are moving their reserves into an asset that has maintained purchasing power for over 5,000 years. I am not suggesting you move every single dollar you have into gold. That would be a foolish error in asset allocation. What I am suggesting is that you view your portfolio through the eyes of a central banker. You need a core of stable assets that are not dependent on the stability of a single government. You need assets that perform well when confidence in the institutional system begins to wane. In my own journey to $100,000, I learned that defense is just as important as offense. I spent my early years trying to hit home runs with speculative stocks that looked good on paper. Most of them ended up being zeros. The real wealth came when I stopped trying to outsmart the market and started trying to protect against the downside. That is the lesson that the central banks are finally learning as they diversify away from dollar-denominated debt. They are choosing durability over velocity. They are choosing an asset that requires no counterparty. If you look at the performance of gold over the last 20 years, you will see that it consistently provides a hedge against the inflation of fiat supplies. It is boring, it is static, it does not pay a dividend, but that is precisely why it is valuable in a world of hyperactive financial manipulation. Think about the psychological toll of watching your savings lose value due to institutional policy decisions. It is frustrating, and it feels like you are running on a treadmill that keeps speeding up. But you have the power to step off that treadmill by diversifying your holdings. You can hold a portion of your wealth in gold or silver to ensure that you are not fully dependent on a single failing system. We often talk about financial literacy as the ability to read a balance sheet, but true financial literacy is the ability to read the macro trends that dictate whether that balance sheet will actually hold its value. When the central banks of China, Russia, India, and Saudi Arabia all start moving in the same direction, you should pay close attention. They are not doing it for fun. They are doing it because they see the cracks in the dam and they want to be on the side of the river that does not flood. I want you to imagine a world 10 years from now where the currency you use today has lost 30% of its purchasing power. How will you feel if you held onto your cash instead of diversifying? How will you feel if you watched the warning signs and did nothing? That feeling of regret is something I want you to avoid at all costs. It is the reason I create these videos. I want to share the research and the logic that helped me get my own financial house in order. I am not an advisor in the traditional sense of managing your money for you. I am just a peer who has spent years studying the hard data of how money really functions. I encourage you to read the reports from institutions like Goldman Sachs for yourself. Do not take my word for it. Read the source material, verify the data, look at the charts of central bank reserve compositions over the last 5 years. When you see the trend line with your own eyes, you will understand why I am so concerned about the trajectory of the dollar. It is not about hating the dollar, it is about being a realist who understands that every currency in history has a life cycle. If we are currently in the later stages of that cycle, it is only prudent to prepare. Take the time to assess your own personal risk profile. If you are young, you have time to weather the volatility, but if you are close to retirement, you have less room for error. You need to be absolutely certain that your savings are protected against systemic failures. We are entering a period of history where the old rules of finance are being rewritten. The era of low inflation and consistent growth is looking more and more like an anomaly rather than a permanent state. We are returning to a period where hard assets matter, gold matters, silver matters, land matters, commodities matter. If you are holding only paper assets, you are taking on a massive amount of unhedged risk. I hope this conversation has given you some perspective on how to view these massive shifts. As we wrap up this midnight conversation, I want you to remember that the goal is not to predict the exact day of a collapse. The goal is to build a system of preservation that can withstand the inevitable volatility of history, stay disciplined, and focus on the assets that have preserved human wealth for thousands of years. Thank you for spending this time with me to look at the real numbers behind the headlines. Take care of your capital and protect your downside.